The old wooden porch creaked beneath Thomas Cooper's boots as he stood watching the sunset over his vast ranch, his weathered hands resting on the railing. Years of training elite military snipers had taught him to notice even the slightest movement. In the distance, tonight, something felt different. The shadows cast by the setting sun seemed longer, darker, and the usual peaceful silence of his 500-acre property was replaced by an unsettling stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas had spent the last 15 years turning his family's struggling cattle ranch into one of the most prestigious private training facilities for Special Forces snipers in the country. The remote location, varying terrain, and his own extensive military background made it the perfect setting for honing the skills of America's finest warriors. But tonight, as he watched several unfamiliar vehicles approach from the distant road, he knew his expertise would be tested in ways he never imagined. The ranch house stood silent, its familiar creaks and groans muted by the tension in the air. Thomas moved with practiced precision toward his office, his steps barely making a sound despite his large frame. The walls were lined with photographs of the hundreds of elite soldiers he'd trained over the years, their faces a reminder of the skills he'd helped refine. His most recent group of trainees had left just yesterday, leaving him alone on the property for the first time in months. Behind his desk, a worn leather chair held memories of countless briefings and after-action reviews. Thomas settled into it, his eyes fixed on the security monitors that showed various angles of his property. The approaching vehicles were still a few miles out, but their pattern of movement was unmistakable. Years of combat experience told him these weren't lost tourists or local ranchers. As he watched the monitors, his mind drifted to the events of the past few weeks. The cartel's presence in the area had been growing, their operations becoming bolder. He'd heard whispers from local ranchers about threats, intimidation, and violence. But Thomas knew there was more to it. His training facility had become a thorn in their side, producing skilled operators who had disrupted their operations across the border. The sound of gravel crunching under tires brought him back to the present. The vehicles were closer now, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Thomas reached for his satellite phone, sending a prearranged signal to his closest ally, former Marine Corps scout sniper Marcus Reynolds, who lived in the nearby town. They had developed contingency plans for situations like this, though neither had expected to need them so soon. Thomas moved to the gun safe hidden behind a false panel in his office wall. The combination came naturally to his fingers as he retrieved his customized M40A6 sniper rifle, the same model he'd used during his final tour in Afghanistan. The weapon was more than just a tool. It was an extension of himself, carefully maintained and modified over years of use. As he checked his equipment, Thomas couldn't help but smile grimly at the irony. The cartel had chosen to target his ranch, not knowing that they were walking into the domain of someone who had spent decades teaching others how to handle exactly this type of situation. His property was more than just a ranch. It was a carefully designed training ground with hidden positions, pre-measured distances, and natural surveillance points that he knew like the back of his hand. The security monitors showed the vehicles stopping at his front gate. 7 men emerged, heavily armed, and moving with the confidence of those used to intimidation. Their weapons were military grade, their movements suggesting some level of training, but Thomas could see the flaws in their formation, the gaps in their awareness that his trained eye couldn't miss. He moved to his preferred observation point, a reinforced window on the second floor that overlooked the main approach to the ranch house. The position offered clear lines of sight while keeping him hidden from view. Through his rifle's scope, he could see their faces clearly now. The leader, a man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, was directing the others with sharp hand gestures. The sound of breaking glass from the barn caught everyone's attention. The cartel members had begun their intimidation tactics, but they'd made their first mistake. The barn wasn't just a storage space, it was where Thomas kept some of his most sophisticated training equipment. More importantly, it was designed to be a defensive position, with reinforced walls and carefully planned firing ports. Thomas's satellite phone vibrated silently in his pocket. Marcus had received his signal and was already mobilizing their emergency response team, a select group of former trainees who lived within an hour's drive. But Thomas knew he would have to hold out on his own for at least 40 minutes before help arrived. The cartel members were spreading out now, their movements becoming more aggressive as they began vandalizing his property. They were sending a message, but they didn't realize they were about to receive one of their own. Thomas had trained hundreds of the world's best snipers, teaching them not just how to shoot, but how to think, how to predict, and how to control every aspect of their environment. As he watched them through his scope, Thomas felt a familiar calm settle over him. The same focus he'd instilled in countless trainees now sharpened his own senses. He could feel the slight breeze from the west, see the subtle way it affected the tall grass below. Every detail was crystal clear, every movement significant. The ranch had been his father's dream, passed down to him along with the values of hard work and dedication. When he'd transformed it into a training facility, some locals had thought he was crazy. But tonight, every obstacle course, every hidden position, and every carefully designed feature would serve its true purpose. Thomas took a deep breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The cartel had made a fatal error in judgment. They thought they were attacking a simple rancher, someone they could easily intimidate or eliminate. Instead, they had walked into the domain of a man who had spent his life preparing others for moments exactly like this. The wind carried the sound of their voices up to his position, Spanish mixed with English, crude jokes and casual threats. They had no idea they were being watched, no concept of the years of experience focused on their every move. Thomas knew he could take the first shot now, but patience had always been his most valuable lesson to his students. Let them make the first real move, let them show their full hand before responding. In the growing darkness, Thomas Cooper, former Marine Corps sniper instructor and owner of America's most elite private training facility, prepared to defend his land. The cartel was about to learn a harsh lesson about judging a book by its cover, and Thomas was going to make sure it was a lesson they'd never forget. The first shots came without warning, shattering the windows of Thomas's prized Mustang parked near the barn. The cartel members laughed, their voices carrying across the ranch yard as they continued their path of destruction. Through his scope, Thomas watched as they grew bolder, moving closer to the main house with each passing minute. The leader, the man with the scar, gestured toward the barn's main doors with his assault rifle. One of the younger cartel members jogged forward, pulling out what looked like explosive charges from his backpack. Thomas's jaw tightened. Those weren't just for show. The barn contained not only millions of dollars worth of specialized training equipment, but also detailed records of every Special Forces operator he'd trained. That information in the wrong hands could compromise dozens of ongoing operations. The satellite phone buzzed again. A text from Marcus, 30 minutes out. Local sheriff notified but compromised. On your own until we arrive. Thomas had expected as much. The cartel's influence ran deep in these parts. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position as he watched the young cartel member begin placing charges around the barn's entrance. The others had spread out, establishing a loose perimeter that showed their lack of proper tactical training. Any one of his students would have identified at least 7 major vulnerabilities in their formation. A memory flashed through his mind. Just last week, he'd been teaching a class about the importance of situational awareness. Your environment is never neutral, he'd told his students. Every tree, every rock, every shadow can either help you or hurt you. The difference lies in who recognizes it first. The ranch had been designed with training in mind, but its features served a dual purpose. The seemingly random placement of equipment and vehicles created natural channels of movement, forcing anyone unfamiliar with the property to take predictable paths. The elevated terrain around the barn offered multiple firing positions, each carefully measured and marked. Even the tall grass had been planted strategically, providing both cover and indicators of wind direction. Thomas watched as the cartel leader made his first major mistake. Frustrated with the time it was taking to set the charges, he moved away from his covered position to hurry his man along. The moment he stepped into the open, Thomas had his shot, clean, clear, and unobstructed. But taking it now would only trigger chaos without control. He needed them to commit fully to their plan before disrupting it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ranch had gone. Quiet, save for the sounds of the cartel members' movements. Even the usual evening chorus of crickets had fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Thomas could feel the weight of generations in this moment. His father had built this ranch from nothing, turning harsh Texas land into a sustainable cattle operation through sheer determination. Thomas had transformed it further, creating a place where America's finest warriors could hone their skills. He wasn't about to let it fall to thugs who thought violence alone made them powerful. Through his scope, Thomas observed each cartel member's behavior, noting their patterns and tendencies. The leader was aggressive but cautious, regularly checking his surroundings. 2 members moved like they had military training, possibly deserters. The others were younger, more reckless, likely chosen for their willingness to follow orders without question. The charges were almost set when Thomas noticed a subtle change in their formation. They were tightening their perimeter, preparing for the explosion. The leader raised his hand, signaling the others to ready themselves. This was it. They had committed to their course of action. Thomas's finger moved to the trigger, his breathing settling into the familiar rhythm of controlled shots. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and heavy with tension. Through his scope, he could see every detail of the scene below with perfect clarity. The first shot would trigger a sequence of events that couldn't be undone. Thomas had trained countless snipers for moments like this, teaching them that each shot was a decision that carried weight beyond the immediate impact. A sniper's greatest weapon, he always told his students, isn't his rifle, it's his judgment. As if sensing the approaching danger, one of the cartel members looked up, scanning the windows of the main house. His eyes passed over Thomas's position without pausing. The camouflage and concealment techniques Thomas had perfected over decades of experience kept him invisible even at this close range. The leader moved to check the charges one final time, presenting his back to Thomas's position. It was almost insulting how casually they had approached this operation, how little respect they showed for the property they were about to destroy. They had expected to find a simple rancher, someone who could be easily intimidated or eliminated. Instead, they had walked into the domain of a man who had spent his life preparing others for war. Thomas's mind was clear, his focus absolute. Every lesson he had taught, every principle he had instilled in his students, now guided his own actions. The ranch wasn't just his home. It was a testament to everything he believed in, everything he had fought to protect. The cartel leader raised his hand again, preparing to give the signal to detonate the charges. In that moment, Thomas Cooper made his decision. The first shot would change everything, but he was ready. He had been ready for this moment his entire life. The sound of his rifle would shatter the evening silence, but it wouldn't be a random act of violence. It would be the beginning of a carefully orchestrated response, a demonstration of the difference between those who used force and those who had mastered it. Time seemed to slow as Thomas exhaled softly, his crosshairs settling on their target. The cartel was about to learn the difference between attacking a simple ranch and invading the home of a man who had trained America's deadliest warriors. More importantly, they were about to understand why experience and skill would always triumph over brute force and intimidation. In the growing darkness of the Texas evening, Thomas Cooper prepared to defend not just his property, but everything it represented. The lessons he had taught, the skills he had honed, and the principles he had lived by were about to be put to the ultimate test. The cartel had chosen this fight, but he would decide how it ended. The first shot rang out with surgical precision, striking the detonator in the cartel leader's hand. The device exploded harmlessly, sending the man staggering backward as chaos erupted across the ranch yard. Thomas's next shot found its mark before anyone could react, dropping one of the military-trained cartel members who'd been reaching for his radio. 2 targets down, Thomas whispered to himself, already shifting his position. The remaining cartel members scattered, their formation dissolving into panic as they struggled to identify where the shots had come from. Their training, whatever they had, was breaking down in the face of an unseen enemy. Through his scope, Thomas watched as they made their second critical mistake. Instead of retreating to their vehicles, they sought cover behind the ranch equipment scattered across the yard, exactly as he had designed it. Each piece of machinery, every parked trailer and stack of hay bales had been positioned to create killing zones, areas where targets would naturally seek cover but find themselves trapped. A memory surfaced as he lined up his next shot. 6 months ago, he'd been teaching a class about terrain manipulation. The best trap, he'd told his students, is one the enemy walks into willingly. Make them think they're making their own choices, when really they're following the path you've laid out for them. The cartel members were shouting to each other in Spanish, trying to coordinate a response. Thomas understood enough to know they were planning to fall back to their vehicles, but the path they would have to take was already in his crosshairs. He squeezed the trigger twice more, the shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. 2 more went down, leaving only 3. Thomas moved quickly to another pre-prepared position, knowing they would have traced his previous location from the muzzle flash. This wasn't just about eliminating threats. It was about controlling the battlefield, about demonstrating the difference between those who used violence and those who had mastered the art of combat. One of the remaining cartel members made a break for the vehicles, running in a zigzag pattern that showed some level of training. But Thomas had trained snipers to hit targets moving far more erratically at greater distances. The shot caught the man mid-stride, and he crumpled to the ground. The last two had taken cover behind Thomas's old tractor, probably thinking its engine block would provide adequate protection. What they didn't realize was that the tractor's position had been carefully chosen to funnel targets into a natural crossfire. From his new position, Thomas had a clear shot at both men, but before he could take the shot, something unexpected happened. One of the cartel members stood up, hands raised. "Espera! Para! We surrender!" he shouted in heavily accented English. "We were not told this place was protected." Thomas kept his scope trained on the man, but didn't fire. In all his years of training snipers, he taught them that knowing when not to take a shot was just as important as knowing when to pull the trigger. The second man slowly stood as well, dropping his weapon. "Hands where I can see them," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the yard with command authority. "On your knees, fingers laced behind your heads." The men complied immediately, their previous bravado replaced by genuine fear. Thomas maintained his position, watching through his scope as they followed his instructions. In the distance, he could hear vehicles approaching. Marcus and his response team were almost here. 20 minutes had passed since the first shot. In that time, Thomas Cooper had demonstrated why experience and skill would always triumph over brute force. But more importantly, he had shown why the principles he taught, patience, precision, and tactical thinking, were more than just military doctrine. As Marcus's vehicles pulled up to the ranch, Thomas reflected on the night's events. The cartel had come expecting to find a vulnerable target, someone they could easily intimidate or eliminate. Instead, they had encountered a man who had spent his life preparing others for exactly this type of situation. Marcus and his team secured the survivors while Thomas maintained his overwatch position. The two cartel members who had surrendered were providing information, explaining how they had been ordered to send a message to the old rancher who was interfering with their operations. "You okay up there, old man?" Marcus called out once the situation was secure. Thomas emerged from his position, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Getting too old for this kind of excitement," he replied with a grim smile. But they both knew that wasn't true. Age hadn't diminished his skills, it had only refined them. The local sheriff arrived shortly after, one of the few honest ones left in the region. As Thomas gave his statement, he noticed the respect in the eyes of the younger officers. They had heard stories about the old rancher who trained special forces snipers, but now they had proof of why his training facility was considered the best in the country. Later that night, as the scene was being processed and the survivors taken into custody, Marcus joined Thomas on the porch. "You know they'll try again," he said, looking out over the property. "The cartel doesn't take kindly to losing men." Thomas nodded, cleaning his rifle with practiced precision. "Let them come," he said quietly. "Each time they do, they'll learn the same lesson. That true strength isn't found in numbers or firepower, but in skill, preparation, and the willingness to stand your ground." The events of the night had proven something Thomas had been teaching for years. That one well-trained individual, fighting on familiar ground with proper preparation, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It wasn't about the number of rounds fired or the size of the force. It was about precision, patience, and the application of well-honed skills. As the sun began to rise over his ranch, Thomas Cooper knew that this wasn't the end. The cartel would indeed try again, perhaps with greater numbers or different tactics, but they would find the same result, because this ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was a testament to everything he had learned and taught over decades of service. The morning light revealed the evidence of the night's battle: spent casings, scattered equipment, and the marks of a fight that had been over almost before it began. But it also showed something else, that the principles Thomas had spent his life teaching were more than just theory. They were the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat. Tomorrow, new students would arrive for training. They would learn not just from his instruction, but from the fresh examples of how proper training and preparation could overcome any threat. The ranch would continue its mission, producing warriors who understood that true combat effectiveness came not from aggression, but from skill, judgment, and unwavering dedication to their craft. Thomas Cooper stood watching the sunrise, his rifle clean and ready at his side. The cartel had learned a costly lesson about underestimating their targets, but more importantly, they had provided a powerful demonstration of why the skills he taught were so vital. In a world where violence often seemed random and chaotic, there would always be a place for those who understood the true meaning of precision and control. The aftermath of the firefight brought unexpected challenges. As Thomas surveyed his property in the early morning light, his satellite phone buzzed with urgent messages from his network of former students and allies. The cartel's reach was greater than he had anticipated. Reports were coming in of similar attacks on other training facilities across Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Thomas gathered his closest allies in the ranch's command center, a reinforced underground bunker he'd built beneath the barn. Marcus Reynolds stood at his side, while 4 other former Special Forces operators hunched over satellite maps and intelligence reports. The room hummed with the energy of seasoned warriors preparing for battle. "They're not just targeting me," Thomas explained, pointing to red markers on the digital map. "This is a coordinated effort to shut down military training facilities across the border states. They're trying to blind our operations, gentlemen." The intelligence painted a clear picture. The cartel had evolved, hiring former military contractors and developing sophisticated strategies. They weren't just drug runners anymore. They were waging a shadow war against anyone who might pose a threat to their operations. "This is bigger than we thought," Marcus said, his finger tracing patterns on the map. "They've got spotters watching major highways, informants in local law enforcement. They're building an infrastructure." Thomas nodded, but there was a glint in his eye that his companions recognized. It was the same look he got when teaching particularly challenging courses. They've made a critical error in judgment. They think they're fighting individual ranchers and retired soldiers. They don't realize they're taking on a network. Cover. The years, Thomas had trained hundreds of elite operators. Each student who passed through his ranch became part of an unofficial brotherhood. Now, that brotherhood was mobilizing. Encrypted messages flew across secure channels as former students offered support, intelligence, and resources. "Sir," One of the younger operators spoke up. "I've got confirmation from 3 Delta teams who trained here last spring. They're requesting leave to assist unofficially." Thomas raised his hand. "No active duty personnel. We handle this ourselves. We're not starting an international incident." He paused, studying the map. "But we are going to teach them why you don't attack a teacher without considering his students." The next few hours were spent developing a comprehensive response plan. Thomas's ranch would become the central hub of operations, coordinating with other training facilities to create a united defense network. But they wouldn't just be reacting. They would take the fight to the cartel in ways they wouldn't expect. "The cartel thinks in terms of force," Thomas explained, outlining his strategy. "They believe in overwhelming numbers and firepower. We're going to show them why quality always beats quantity." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Using intelligence gathered from Thomas's network, they would identify key cartel observation posts and staging areas. Small teams of former operators would move independently, dismantling the cartel's infrastructure piece by piece. No direct confrontations, no large-scale battles, just precise surgical strikes that would erode their ability to operate. "Remember your training," Thomas told the assembled group. "This isn't about body counts or dramatic showdowns. We win by being smarter, more disciplined, and more patient than they are." As the others prepared to deploy, Marcus pulled Thomas aside. "You know they'll figure out what we're doing. They'll come at you with everything they've got." Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that had preceded many of his most successful training operations. "That's exactly what I'm counting on. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to let your opponent think they're winning until it's too late." Over the next few days, Thomas's strategy began to bear fruit. Reports came in of cartel observation posts being neutralized, supply lines disrupted, and communication networks compromised. Each operation was conducted with the precision and professionalism that had become hallmarks of his training program. But Thomas knew the cartel wouldn't take these losses lightly. He spent his time preparing his ranch for the inevitable counterattack, but not in ways the cartel would expect. Instead of fortifying obvious defensive positions, he transformed the entire property into an elaborate training scenario. "The best defense," he told Marcus as they worked, "is making your enemy fight on your terms without them realizing it." They modified the terrain subtly, creating natural channeling points that would force attackers into pre-sighted killing zones. Every piece of equipment, every structure, every seemingly random obstacle was positioned with purpose. The ranch became a masterpiece of tactical design, a lesson in advanced battlefield preparation that would have made his students proud. Thomas also implemented some of his more innovative training techniques. Hidden speakers were placed throughout the property, capable of broadcasting sounds that would confuse and disorient attackers. Thermal blankets were strategically placed to create false heat signatures. Even the patterns in which the cattle grazed were carefully managed to provide early warning of approaching threats. "You're turning your entire ranch into one big lesson plan," Marcus observed with admiration. Thomas nodded, making final adjustments to a concealed observation post. "Every fight is a teaching opportunity. The cartel thinks they're dealing with a simple rancher who trains soldiers. They're about to learn they're dealing with someone who has spent decades studying how to control and dominate a battlefield." As night fell, Thomas received word that the cartel was mobilizing significant forces. Their losses had forced them to accelerate their timeline, just as he had predicted. But instead of fear, Thomas felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same feeling he got before starting a new training class. The satisfaction of knowing he was about to impart valuable lessons to those who needed them most. In his command center, Thomas reviewed the latest intelligence with his core team. The cartel was bringing in specialists, former military contractors with impressive credentials. They had studied the failed attack on his ranch and were developing what they thought was a foolproof plan to overwhelm his defenses. They're learning, Marcus noted, studying the intercepted communications. That makes them more dangerous. Thomas smiled, the expression barely visible in the dim light of the underground bunker. They're learning the wrong lessons. They think the first attack failed because they didn't bring enough men or firepower. They haven't understood that this isn't about numbers or equipment. It's about skill, preparation, and understanding how to control a battlefield. As his team made final preparations, Thomas took a moment to walk his property alone. The ranch had been his father's legacy, transformed by Thomas into something unique, a place where America's finest warriors came to hone their skills. Now, it would serve its ultimate purpose, becoming both classroom and testing ground for one final crucial lesson. The wind carried the distant sound of vehicles moving under cover of darkness. The cartel was coming, bringing with them all the force and firepower they thought they needed. But they were about to learn what Thomas's students had learned over years of training, that true victory comes not from overwhelming force, but from the perfect application of skill, knowledge, and unwavering determination. The first warning came from an unexpected source: the cattle. Thomas had trained his herds to respond to specific whistles, a technique he'd developed for special reconnaissance courses. When the herd suddenly shifted their grazing pattern toward the eastern fence line, he knew the cartel's advance teams had arrived. From his command center, Thomas watched through an array of sophisticated surveillance systems as dark figures moved across his land. The cartel had sent their best this time, former special operations contractors whose movements showed their training. They moved in disciplined formations, using proper tactical spacing and communication protocols. "They've done their homework," Marcus observed, studying the thermal imaging displays. "Those aren't cartel thugs. They're professionals." Thomas nodded, but his expression remained confident. "Good. That means they'll think they know what they're doing. There's nothing more dangerous than a trained operator who's forgotten he can still learn." The cartel's advance team was methodically sweeping the property, using thermal imaging and night vision equipment to search for defensive positions. They moved with precision, checking every potential hiding spot, marking locations on tactical maps. What they didn't realize was that every discovery they made was exactly what Thomas wanted them to find. "Watch this," Thomas said, gesturing to one of the monitors. The lead element of the cartel's team had just discovered a hidden sniper nest. They marked it on their maps, feeling confident they'd found one of Thomas's key defensive positions. What they didn't know was that the position had been deliberately leaked, a false target designed to draw attention away from the real observation posts. Hours passed as the advance team completed their reconnaissance. Thomas watched them transmit their findings back to their command element, no doubt feeling confident they had mapped out all of his defenses. In reality, they had fallen for the first layer of his elaborate deception. "Remember what I always tell my students," Thomas said to his team as they monitored the situation. "The most dangerous assumption in combat is believing you've figured out your enemy's plan." The main cartel force arrived just before midnight, a convoy of armored vehicles carrying at least 40 heavily armed operators. They moved with military precision, establishing a perimeter and setting up sophisticated communication equipment. Their commander, a former Delta Force operator Thomas recognized from intelligence briefings, coordinated their deployment with professional efficiency. "They're setting up for a textbook assault," Marcus noted, watching the cartel forces move into position. "Multiple angles of attack, support by fire positions, even counter-sniper teams." Thomas smiled. "Yes, they're following their training perfectly, but they're about to learn the difference between knowing the playbook and understanding the game." The cartel's attack began with a sophisticated electronic warfare package: signal jammers, infrared strobes, and sonic disruptors designed to neutralize security systems and disorient defenders. They expected this to blind Thomas's surveillance and communication capabilities. Instead, these systems activated specific pre-planned responses across the ranch. Hidden speakers began broadcasting carefully selected sounds, the subtle noises of movement in unexpected locations, false radio transmissions, and the occasional crack of a dry branch. Each sound was precisely timed and positioned to create uncertainty in the minds of the attackers. The cartel's first assault team moved toward what they believed was Thomas's primary defensive position. They used textbook tactics: bounding, overwatch, proper fields of fire, and careful coordination. But as they approached their objective, the ground beneath their feet suddenly shifted. They had triggered one of Thomas's terrain modifications, a section of apparently solid ground that gave way to reveal its true nature as unstable soil. "The first lesson," Thomas commented as the assault team scrambled to regain their footing, "is never assume the ground you're standing on is what it appears to be." The cartel's commander quickly adjusted his plan, redirecting forces to what he believed were safer approach routes. But each avenue of advance had been carefully prepared with similar surprises. Hidden irrigation pipes created sudden mudslicks. Carefully positioned cattle panels, invisible in the darkness, disrupted formation spacing. Every step forward forced them to deal with another carefully planned obstacle. "They're getting frustrated," Marcus observed, "starting to rush their movements." Thomas nodded. "That's the second lesson. Emotion is the enemy of execution. Once you let frustration dictate your actions, you've already lost." The cartel forces had now split into smaller elements, trying to probe for weaknesses in what they assumed was Thomas's defensive network. Each team reported finding what appeared to be critical positions or equipment, more false targets that Thomas had prepared specifically for this purpose. As the attackers became increasingly focused on these decoys, Thomas's real defensive positions remained undetected. He had hidden them using techniques that went beyond standard military doctrine, incorporating lessons learned from decades of studying how people think and move in combat situations. "Sir," one of Thomas's team members reported, "they're setting up their heavy weapons. Looks like they're preparing for a final push." Thomas watched as the cartel forces consolidated their positions. They had fallen for every piece of misdirection, every carefully planned deception. Now they were committed to a plan based entirely on false information. "The final lesson," Thomas said, reaching for his rifle, "is understanding that combat isn't about who has the most guns or the best equipment. It's about who controls the battlefield. With precise timing, Thomas initiated his true defensive plan. Hidden lights activated strategically, casting harsh shadows that disrupted the cartel forces' night vision. The cattle, responding to hidden, sonic signals, began moving in patterns that forced the attackers to adjust their positions. Then Thomas's team opened fire from their real positions, locations that had remained completely hidden throughout the cartel's careful reconnaissance. Each shot was precise, targeting communication equipment, weapons, and key personnel with surgical accuracy. The cartel forces found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't effectively locate or engage. Their carefully planned assault had been transformed into a chaos of their own making, with every attempt to regain control only making their situation worse. This isn't just a defense, Marcus realized as he watched the cartel forces struggling to respond. This is a masterclass in battlefield control. Thomas continued coordinating his team's response, each action precisely timed and positioned. The cartel forces, despite their training and equipment, were being systematically dismantled by an opponent who had turned the entire battlefield into a teaching tool. As the cartel commander finally called for a retreat, Thomas knew they had learned their most important lesson, that true mastery of combat comes not from following doctrine, but from understanding the deeper principles that govern conflict. His ranch had become more than just a defensive position. It had become a demonstration of why experience, wisdom, and proper preparation would always triumph over mere force. The morning after the failed assault, Thomas stood in his observation post, watching the sun rise over his property. The signs of battle were minimal, a testament to the precision with which he had conducted his defense. But he knew the cartel's retreat wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a new phase in this conflict. "We've got movement on the satellite feeds," Marcus reported, joining him with a fresh cup of coffee. "They're regrouping at multiple locations across the border. Something big is brewing." Thomas nodded, taking the coffee. His mind was already working through the implications of the intel they'd gathered during last night's engagement. The cartel had revealed more than just their tactics. They'd shown their entire operational philosophy. "They're adapting faster than expected," Thomas observed, pulling up detailed footage from the previous night's battle. "Notice how they adjusted their formation after the first set of obstacles? That's not standard cartel protocol. They've got someone new calling the shots." The surveillance footage showed the cartel forces moving with increasing sophistication as the battle progressed. Despite their ultimate failure, they had demonstrated an ability to learn and adapt that concerned Thomas. It reminded him of training, exercises he'd run with particularly gifted students, the ones who could evolve their tactics mid-engagement. "I think I know who they've brought in," Marcus said, sliding a file across the desk. "Remember Carlos Santiago?" Thomas opened the file, his expression hardening as he recognized the name. Santiago had been one of his most promising students. Years ago, before disappearing during a classified operation in South America, the official report listed him as killed in action, but Thomas had always had his doubts. "He was my best student in advanced battlefield psychology," Thomas said quietly. "If he's working with the cartel now, that explains their improved tactical awareness." The implications were serious. Santiago didn't just know Thomas's teaching methods, he understood the philosophical foundations behind them. He would be able to anticipate many of Thomas's strategies and countermeasures. But Thomas hadn't survived decades in special operations by being predictable. He gathered his core team in the command center, spreading out new satellite imagery across the digital planning table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're dealing with a new level of threat. The cartel has evolved beyond simple force projection. They're now employing advanced psychological warfare tactics, likely under the direction of one of our own." The room fell silent as Thomas explained the situation. Each person present understood the gravity of facing an opponent who understood their methodologies from the inside. But rather than fear, there was a palpable sense of determination in the air. "So, what's the play, boss?" asked Sarah Chen, a former Navy SEAL who had trained under Thomas for advanced sniper operations. "We can't rely on our usual playbook if they know all our moves." Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that his students had learned to recognize as a prelude to something unexpected. "Who says we're using the usual playbook? Everything we've done so far has been setting the stage for what comes next." He activated the command center's main display, revealing a complex network of locations across the border region. Each point represented a cartel staging area, supply depot, or command node that they had identified over the past weeks. "They think they know our capabilities because they've studied our training programs," Thomas continued. "But what they don't realize is that every course I've taught, every technique I've developed, has been just a fraction of what we can do." The plan Thomas outlined over the next hour was audacious. Instead of waiting for the cartel's next attack, they would implement a strategy that went beyond anything he had ever taught in his courses. It would require perfect coordination, split-second timing, and complete trust in each team member's abilities. "This isn't just about defending the ranch anymore," Thomas explained. "It's about showing them why you never stop learning, why you never assume you know everything your opponent is capable of." The strategy involved using the cartel's own psychology against them. They would appear to follow predictable patterns, drawing the cartel into committing significant resources to what they thought would be decisive engagements. But each engagement would be designed to mask the true purpose of their operations. "Santiago will be looking for the techniques I taught him," Thomas said, "so we'll give him exactly what he expects to see. But while he's focused on countering those moves, we'll be implementing strategies that I developed after he left. Techniques that evolved from years of studying how overconfident operators think and react." The team spent hours refining the details of their plan. Each person had a specific role to play, not just in the physical operation, but in the psychological warfare that would accompany it. They would need to project exactly the right image of capability and intention to make the cartel commit to their desired course of action. As the planning session concluded, Marcus pulled Thomas aside. "This is more than just tactics now, isn't it? This is about teaching them the lesson they missed in training." Thomas nodded, looking out over his property through the command center's armored windows. "The most important lesson I ever teach isn't about shooting or tactics. It's about understanding that true mastery means never stopping learning, never assuming you know everything." The sun was setting as the team began implementing the first phase of their plan. Across the border region, carefully orchestrated movements and communications began drawing the cartel's attention to specific locations and activities. Each piece of information they allowed the cartel to intercept was designed to reinforce their expectations while concealing their true intentions. "Remember," Thomas told his team as they moved into position, "our greatest advantage isn't our weapons or our training. It's our understanding that every engagement is an opportunity to learn and adapt. That's what separates masters from mere practitioners." The night air was thick with tension as they waited for the cartel's response. Thomas knew that somewhere out there, Santiago was watching, analyzing, thinking he knew what his former teacher was planning. But he was about to learn that no matter how much you think you know, there's always more to learn. As the first reports of cartel movement came in, Thomas felt a familiar calm settle over him. This wasn't just about defending his ranch or stopping the cartel. It was about demonstrating why the principles he taught, continuous learning, adaptability, and the understanding that true mastery never ends, were more than just training concepts. They were the fundamental truths that separated survivors from casualties in the real world of combat. The next phase of the conflict was about to begin, and Thomas Cooper was ready to deliver his most important lesson yet. One that would show why a true master never stops evolving, never stops learning, and never assumes they know all there is to know about their craft. The operation began under a moonless sky, with Thomas's team executing their roles with precision that went beyond mere military training. Each movement, each communication, was carefully choreographed to present exactly the image they wanted. The cartel and Santiago to see. Sarah Chen's team had positioned themselves at what appeared to be poorly concealed observation posts along the ranch's perimeter. They made just enough mistakes in their concealment to be noticed by the cartel's reconnaissance elements. Meanwhile, Thomas's actual surveillance teams remained completely hidden, using techniques he'd developed years after Santiago's disappearance. "Contact, Southeast Quadrant," Marcus reported through their encrypted channel. "They're taking the bait exactly as predicted." Thomas watched through his advanced optics as cartel forces began their approach. Santiago had organized them brilliantly, using formations and tactics that would have been perfect against the strategies he'd learned during his training. But Thomas had spent the years since Santiago's departure developing counters to his own techniques. "Time to show them why you never stop evolving," Thomas whispered, initiating the first phase of their true operation. The cartel forces moved with confidence, believing they had identified all of Thomas's defensive positions. They had no way of knowing that every mistake they'd spotted had been carefully planned. Every weakness they'd identified was a deliberate deception. Thomas's new defensive system went beyond anything he'd ever taught in his courses. Instead of relying on fixed positions and predetermined firing lanes, he had created a fluid, adaptive defense that could reshape itself based on the enemy's movements. Hidden sensors and automated systems tracked the cartel's advance, feeding data to Thomas's command center. "Execute Pattern Delta," Thomas commanded, and his team responded instantly. The ranch's terrain began to work against the cartel in subtle but devastating ways. Irrigation systems activated strategically, turning seemingly solid ground into treacherous mud. Hidden speakers broadcasted precisely calculated sounds that made it impossible to accurately determine distances or directions. Santiago, watching through high-powered optics from what he thought was a safe distance, began to realize something was wrong. The defense he was facing wasn't following any pattern he recognized from his training. It was something entirely new. "You see it now, don't you?" Thomas murmured, watching his former students' forces struggle to maintain their cohesion. "This is what happens when you think you know all there is to know." The cartel forces found themselves facing an opponent that seemed to anticipate their every move. Each time they adjusted their tactics, Thomas's defense had already shifted to counter them. It wasn't just about firepower or positioning, it was about understanding the psychology of combat at a level that went beyond traditional military doctrine. Sarah's team initiated their part of the plan, appearing to fall back under pressure. The cartel forces, sensing what they thought was an opportunity, pressed forward into what appeared to be a gap in Thomas's defenses. But they were actually moving exactly where Thomas wanted them. "This is the real lesson," Thomas explained to his team over the comm system. "It's not about what you know, it's about understanding that there's always more to learn." The trap was sprung with devastating precision. The cartel forces found themselves caught in a series of interlocking fields of fire, but not from the war positions they had identified. Thomas's actual defensive positions had remained completely undetected, concealed using techniques that combined ancient wisdom with modern technology. Santiago attempted to rally his forces, demonstrating the skill that had once made him Thomas's best student. But he was fighting against strategies he'd never seen before, facing an opponent who had continued to evolve long after his training had ended. "Pattern Omega," Thomas commanded, initiating the final phase of his defense. The ranch's entire security system activated in perfect synchronization, a symphony of technology and tactical expertise that transformed the battlefield into a teacher's ultimate object lesson. The cartel forces began to break, their carefully planned assault dissolving into chaos. But Thomas wasn't interested in simply defeating them. He wanted this to be a learning experience they would never forget. "Hold fire!" he ordered as the cartel forces retreated. "Let them go. They've learned what they needed to learn." As the dust settled, Thomas watched Santiago's forces disappear into the darkness. He knew this wouldn't be the end. The cartel wouldn't give up easily. But they had received a powerful lesson in the true meaning of mastery. Marcus joined him at the command center, reviewing the battle's data. "They never saw it coming," he observed. "All their intelligence, all their planning, and they still couldn't predict what we'd do." Thomas nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "That's because they were fighting the teacher they thought they knew, not the one I've become." The most important lesson in combat isn't about techniques or tactics. It's about understanding that true mastery means never stopping your own evolution. The team gathered for a debriefing, each member bringing insights from their part in the operation. Thomas listened carefully, already thinking about how to improve and adapt their strategies. Even in victory, he was looking for ways to learn and grow. "The cartel will be back," Sarah noted during the debriefing, "and they'll be stronger for this experience." "Good," Thomas replied, surprising some of his younger team members, "because that means we'll have to be stronger too. Every engagement is an opportunity to learn, to evolve, to become better than we were before." As the team discussed the night's events, Thomas reflected on how far he'd come from his early days as an instructor. The techniques he'd taught Santiago seemed almost primitive now, compared to what he'd developed since. But that was the point. True mastery wasn't about reaching a final destination. It was about understanding that there was always another level to achieve, always more to learn. The sun was rising over the ranch, illuminating the evidence of the night's battle. But where others might have seen signs of conflict, Thomas saw teaching tools, examples he would use to train the next generation of warriors. "Get some rest," he told his team. "Tomorrow we start preparing for the next lesson, because in this line of work, the learning never stops. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you become vulnerable." As his team dispersed, Thomas remained in the command center, already working on new strategies and techniques. The cartel had learned a valuable lesson about underestimating their opponents, but Thomas knew they would adapt and evolve, and that meant he needed to do the same. "The greatest victory," he said to himself, "isn't defeating your enemy. It's proving that there's always more to learn, always room to grow, always another level to reach." The ranch was quiet now, but Thomas knew this peace was temporary. The next challenge would come, and when it did, he would be ready. Not with the same techniques and tactics, but with new strategies born from continuous learning and endless adaptation. Less than 3 hours after the cartel's retreat, Thomas received an unexpected message. One of his surveillance drones had captured footage of Santiago meeting with high-ranking cartel members at a remote compound just across the border. The footage revealed something that made Thomas's blood run cold. They weren't just planning another attack. They were preparing for all-out war. "Look at this," Thomas said, enhancing the drone footage on the command center's main screen. The cartel was mobilizing resources on a scale he'd never seen before. Military-grade vehicles, advanced weapon systems, and what appeared to be electronic warfare equipment were being assembled at multiple staging areas. But what caught Thomas's attention wasn't the hardware. It was the presence of other former Special Operations personnel. He recognized faces from various elite units, men who had served with distinction before disappearing into the private sector. Santiago hadn't just recruited mercenaries. He'd assembled a team of combat specialists who could rival any Special Operations unit. "This isn't just about the ranch anymore," Marcus observed, studying the intelligence. "They're setting up for a campaign. They want to eliminate every training facility that could produce operators capable of disrupting their operations." Thomas nodded, his mind already racing through possibilities. They've realized that individual attacks won't work, so they're changing the game, trying to eliminate the entire system that produces their most dangerous opponents. Sarah Chen arrived with fresh satellite imagery showing cartel forces moving into position around other training facilities across 3 states. "They're going to hit multiple targets simultaneously," she reported, "using our own tactics against us." Thomas stood silent for a moment, processing the information. Then a slight smile crossed his face, the kind his students had learned to recognize as a sign that he was about to turn a seemingly impossible situation into a teaching opportunity. "Santiago thinks he's learned enough to beat us at our own game," Thomas said, moving to the tactical planning table. "But he's forgotten the most important lesson I ever taught, that true victory comes not from what you know, but from how you think." Over the next hour, Thomas outlined a plan that went beyond anything he'd ever attempted in training. It wasn't just about defending individual facilities. It was about transforming the entire region into one massive training ground. Every training facility they're targeting has its own unique strengths, Thomas explained, marking locations on the digital map. "Instead of trying to defend each one individually, we're going to link them together into one coordinated response network." His team watched in amazement as Thomas began connecting patterns they hadn't seen before. Each facility's location, terrain features, and defensive capabilities could complement the others. By coordinating their responses, they could turn the cartel's simultaneous attack plan against itself. "But sir," one of the younger team members spoke up, "how can we coordinate across such a large area? The cartel will be monitoring all communications." Thomas's smile widened. "That's exactly what they expect us to do. Use modern technology to coordinate. Instead, we're going to use methods so old they've been forgotten by most operators." He revealed a system of signals using natural indicators, bird calls, livestock movements, and environmental signs that would be meaningless to anyone who hadn't trained specifically to recognize them. It was a technique he'd developed years ago but had never taught in his regular courses. "The cartel has studied our modern methods," Thomas explained. "They're prepared for encrypted communications, drone surveillance, and tactical data links. But they've forgotten that warfare existed long before technology." As the team began implementing Thomas's plan, they discovered layers of complexity that demonstrated why he was considered one of the finest military instructors in the world. Each defensive position was designed not just to protect its facility, but to channel enemy forces in ways that would benefit the overall strategy. "Remember," Thomas told his team as they prepared to deploy, "our greatest strength isn't our weapons or our technology. It's our ability to think beyond conventional limitations, to see possibilities where others see obstacles." The next 48 hours were a flurry of activity as Thomas's network of former students and allies moved into position. Each person had a specific role to play, but more importantly, each understood the philosophical foundation of their strategy. Santiago's forces began their movement as predicted, advancing on multiple facilities with precision and confidence. They had studied the defenses, planned for every conventional response, and prepared countermeasures for any modern tactical approach. What they hadn't prepared for was a defense that combined ancient wisdom with modern innovation in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Thomas's network began responding, using methods that seemed to defy conventional military doctrine. Cattle herds moved in patterns that appeared random, but actually provided early warning and disrupted enemy movements. Old-fashioned windmills turned in sequences that transmitted messages across vast distances. Even the local wildlife seemed to cooperate, their behaviors altered by hidden sonic devices to create natural warning systems. "They're trying to find our command and control center," Marcus reported, watching the cartel forces' frustration grow. "They can't understand how we're coordinating without modern communications." Thomas nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "That's because they're looking for something that doesn't exist. We're not controlling this defense, we're guiding it. There's a difference that Santiago never fully understood." As the cartel forces pressed their attacks, they found themselves facing a defense that seemed to have no center, no critical nodes to target. Each facility supported the others in ways that couldn't be disrupted by conventional tactics. "This is a true lesson," Thomas explained to his team as they watched the cartel's offensive falter. "Victory doesn't come from having the most advanced technology or the best trained forces. It comes from understanding principles so fundamental that they transcend time and technology." The cartel's simultaneous attacks, which should have overwhelmed the individual facilities, instead found themselves caught in a web of coordinated responses that turned their own momentum against them. Each attempt to adapt their tactics only played further into Thomas's strategy. Santiago, watching his carefully planned offensive disintegrate, finally realized what his former teacher had done. This wasn't just a defensive action, it was a masterclass in strategic thinking that went beyond anything he'd learned during his training. As the sun set on the second day of battle, the cartel forces began a disorganized retreat. They had been defeated not by superior firepower or technology, but by a level of strategic thinking that had turned their own strengths into weaknesses. Thomas gathered his team for a final briefing, but instead of celebrating their victory, he was already analyzing ways to improve their performance. The moment you think you've mastered something, he told them, is the moment you stop growing. Today wasn't about winning a battle. It was about demonstrating why continuous learning and adaptation are the true foundations of success. The cartel's offensive had been stopped, but Thomas knew this wasn't the end. Santiago and his forces would learn from this defeat, adapt their tactics, and try again. But that was exactly what Thomas wanted, because each engagement was an opportunity to push the boundaries of tactical and strategic innovation even further. "Get some rest," he told his team. "Tomorrow we start preparing for the next evolution. Because in this profession, the learning never stops, the adaptation never ends, and the moment you think you know everything is the moment you've lost." In the aftermath of their successful defense, Thomas received intelligence that changed everything. Santiago hadn't retreated in defeat. He had withdrawn to implement a strategy that went beyond anything they had anticipated. The cartel wasn't just targeting training facilities anymore. They were going after the entire support network that made their operations possible. "They're attacking our supply lines, our intelligence networks, even our families," Marcus reported, spreading out new surveillance photos across the command center's table. "Santiago's turned this into a personal vendetta. He's trying to prove he's surpassed his teacher by destroying everything you've built." Thomas studied the intelligence with a calm that belied the gravity of the situation. The photos showed cartel teams moving against targets they shouldn't have known existed, safe houses, equipment caches, and support personnel locations that had been kept off all official records. "He's not just using what I taught him," Thomas observed, noting patterns in the cartel's operations. "He's taken those lessons and evolved them in ways I didn't expect." "Good. That means he's finally learning the real lesson, that true mastery requires going beyond what you've been taught." Sarah Chen arrived with more troubling news. The cartel had begun targeting the families of former students, applying pressure that threatened to fracture their defensive network. Several operators had already withdrawn to protect their loved ones, leaving gaps in their coverage. But where others saw crisis, Thomas saw opportunity. "Santiago thinks he's found our weakness, but he's actually revealed his own. He still thinks in terms of conventional pressure points, targets you can threaten or destroy. He hasn't understood that true strength comes from something deeper." Thomas gathered his core team, including those whose families had been threatened. Instead of trying to convince them to stay, he shared a vision that transformed their understanding of the situation. "Your families aren't your weakness," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "They're your strength. They're why we fight, why we train, why we never stop trying to be better than we were yesterday. Santiago thinks threatening them will make us vulnerable. Instead, it's going to show him why family men are the most dangerous fighters in the world." Over the next hours, Thomas outlined a plan that turned conventional protective operations on their head. Instead of withdrawing their families to safe locations, they would integrate them into their defense in ways the cartel couldn't anticipate. Every person has value, has skills, has something to contribute, Thomas explained. A housewife who knows her local community can provide better intelligence than any surveillance system. A teenager who plays video games understands network dynamics in ways many operators never will. A grandparent who's lived in an area for decades knows every hiding spot and escape route. The plan was audacious, transforming their defensive network into a community-based operation that defied traditional military doctrine. Families weren't just protected, they became active participants in ways that enhanced rather than hindered their security. The cartel expects us to react like soldiers, Thomas continued. They're prepared for military responses, tactical maneuvers, and strategic withdrawals. What they're not prepared for is a response that comes from understanding the true strength lies in unity, in family, in community. As the plan took shape, Thomas's team began to see the genius in his approach. By integrating families into their operations, they weren't just protecting them. They were creating a defense that was stronger and more resilient than any purely military response could be. Local communities became early warning networks, with normal daily activities serving as cover for sophisticated surveillance operations. School bus routes doubled as reconnaissance patterns. Shopping trips became opportunities for counter-surveillance. Every aspect of normal life was transformed into a defensive asset without ever appearing to change. "This is why we train," Thomas explained to his team. "Not just to be better fighters, but to understand that true security comes from building something larger than ourselves. Santiago thinks targeting our families makes us vulnerable. He's about to learn why you never threaten a warrior's family." The cartel's next series of attacks found themselves facing a defense they couldn't understand or counter. Their surveillance was confused by patterns that seemed random, but were actually carefully coordinated through community activities. Their attempts at intimidation were met with responses that came from unexpected directions. Thomas watched from his command center as Santiago's forces struggled to adapt to a situation that defied their understanding of military operations. "He's still thinking like a soldier," Thomas observed. "He hasn't learned that the strongest warriors aren't the ones who fight alone, but the ones who fight for something larger than themselves." The cartel's offensive began to falter as they encountered resistance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Every attempt to apply pressure was met with responses that turned their own tactics against them. Communities that should have been vulnerable proved to be remarkably resilient. "You see it now, don't you?" Thomas asked during a team briefing. "This isn't just about tactical superiority or strategic advantage. It's about understanding that true strength comes from building connections, from creating something that's bigger than any individual." Santiago's frustration became evident as his carefully planned operations continued to fail. He had studied military doctrine, mastered advanced tactics, and assembled a force of elite operators. But he was losing to something he couldn't quantify or counter: the strength of a community united in purpose. As the cartel's attacks were repeatedly thwarted, Thomas gathered his team for a lesson that went beyond military training. "The greatest victory," he told them, "isn't defeating your enemy. It's building something they can't defeat. Santiago thought targeting our families would weaken us. Instead, it's shown him why family and community are the strongest foundations any warrior can have." The transformation of their defensive network continued, evolving into something that transcended traditional military operations. Every family, every community member became part of a living, breathing defense that was more effective than any conventional force. "This is the lesson Santiago never learned," Thomas explained to his team. "That true mastery isn't just about being the best fighter or the most skilled tactician. It's about understanding that our greatest strength comes from the connections we build, the communities we protect, and the families we fight for." As the sun set on another day of successful defense, Thomas knew that this wasn't just about stopping the cartel. It was about demonstrating a truth that went beyond combat, that the strongest warriors aren't lone fighters, but those who understand that true power comes from building and protecting something larger than themselves. The cartel would learn, as Santiago was learning, that you can't defeat an enemy by attacking their strength, and there is no greater strength than a community united in purpose, guided by wisdom, and fighting to protect what they love. The morning brought unexpected news that shifted the entire dynamic of their conflict. Thomas's intelligence network had intercepted communications revealing that Santiago was facing pressure from within the cartel itself. His repeated failures had cost the organization millions, and now the cartel's leadership was demanding immediate results. "They've given him 48 hours, Marcus reported, showing Thomas the intercepted messages. "Either he eliminates our network completely, or they're replacing him permanently." Thomas studied the intelligence with careful consideration. He knew Santiago well enough to understand what this meant. A desperate opponent was unpredictable, and Santiago had always been most dangerous when backed into a corner. "He'll throw everything at us now," Thomas explained to his assembled team. "No more careful planning, no more strategic patience. He's going to come at us with everything he has all at once. This is where we find out if our new approach can withstand a storm." The early warning signs came within hours. Cartel forces were mobilizing on an unprecedented scale, pulling resources from operations across 3 countries. Santiago was assembling an army, but more than that, he was gathering every piece of advanced military hardware he could acquire. Sarah's reconnaissance team reported convoy after convoy moving toward the border. "They've got everything. Gunships, electronic warfare units, even some experimental tech that looks military-grade. Santiago's calling in every favor, every contact he ever made." But Thomas remained calm, even as his team processed the gravity of what they were facing. "Santiago's making his final mistake," he observed. "He's still thinking in terms of conventional warfare, gathering the biggest force, the most advanced equipment. He hasn't understood that the outcome of this fight was decided the moment he chose to target our families." Over the next 24 hours, Thomas implemented the final phase of his community-based defense strategy. But instead of fortifying positions or establishing defensive perimeters, he focused on strengthening the connections between people. "The cartel thinks they're facing a military organization," Thomas explained during a community meeting that included both operators and families. "What they're actually facing is something far more powerful. A community that has learned to function as one organism, where every person, every family, every connection makes the whole stronger. NADI, the integration of civilian and military capabilities, reached new levels. Local farmers coordinated their irrigation schedules to create natural obstacles that would channel enemy movements. School bus drivers adjusted their routes to provide mobile surveillance platforms. Even the local weather station became part of their early warning network. "This is what Santiago never understood," Thomas told his team as they watched the community preparations. "He thinks power comes from weapons and tactics. He's about to learn that true power comes from unity, from purpose, from fighting for something larger than yourself." The cartel's attack began at dawn. Exactly as Thomas had predicted, Santiago launched a multi-pronged assault that would have overwhelmed any conventional defense. Gunships provided air support while ground forces advanced. In armored columns, electronic warfare units attempted to blind their communications and surveillance systems. But what they encountered wasn't a military defense. It was a living, breathing community response that adapted and flowed around their every move. Farmers' irrigation systems activated strategically, turning fields into impassable mud at crucial moments. School buses, seemingly on normal routes, provided real-time intelligence on cartel movements. Every aspect of civilian life became part of their defense without ever appearing to be military in nature. "Watch and learn," Thomas instructed his younger team members as the battle unfolded. "This is why community matters more than firepower. Santiago's forces are fighting an enemy they can't see or understand, because they're looking for military targets while facing a unified community." The cartel's advanced electronic warfare systems proved useless against a communication network based on children's soccer games and grocery shopping patterns. Their armored vehicles found themselves trapped by coordinated civilian traffic, patterns that seemed completely natural but were precisely planned. Santiago's frustration became evident as his forces encountered resistance that didn't match any military doctrine or tactical pattern he knew. Every attempt to adapt or adjust his strategy was met with responses that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "He still doesn't see it," Thomas observed, watching through his command center's monitors. "He's looking for a military organization to fight, but he's actually fighting something far more powerful, a community that has learned to think and act as one." As the battle entered its crucial phase, Thomas implemented the final element of his strategy. Instead of concentrating their defense around obvious military targets, they dispersed it throughout the community in ways that made it impossible to target effectively. "Remember," he told his team, "our strength isn't in our weapons or our tactics. It's in our unity, our purpose, and our understanding that every person, every family, every connection makes us stronger." The cartel's offensive began to falter as they encountered resistance that defied conventional military response. Their attempts to apply overwhelming force were met with defensive measures that seemed to anticipate their every move, while never presenting a clear target. Santiago's final push came as sunset approached. He committed all his remaining forces in a desperate attempt to achieve the victory his cartel masters demanded. But what he encountered was more than just military resistance. It was the combined strength of a community united in purpose and resolve. Thomas watched from his command position as Santiago's forces were systematically dismantled, not by superior firepower or advanced tactics, but by the coordinated actions of an entire community working in perfect harmony. "This is the final lesson," Thomas told his team as they watched the cartel forces retreat in disarray. "True strength doesn't come from weapons or tactics. It comes from building something that can't be defeated, because its power lies in the connections between people, in the unity of purpose that turns an entire community into something greater than the sum of its parts. As night fell and the last of Santiago's forces withdrew, Thomas gathered his team and the community leaders who had made their victory possible. The cartel had thrown everything they had at them, and they had prevailed not through military might, but through the power of unity and common purpose. "Remember this day," Thomas told them, "not because we won a battle, but because we proved something far more important, that the strongest defense isn't built with walls or weapons, but with the bonds between people who understand that protecting each other is the greatest strength of all." The cartel would learn from this defeat, as would Santiago if he survived his failure. But more importantly, a lesson had been taught that went beyond military doctrine or tactical theory. True power, true security, comes not from force of arms, but from the unbreakable bonds of a community united in purpose and resolve. The aftermath of Santiago's failed assault brought an unexpected development. Through their intelligence network, Thomas learned that his former student hadn't returned to the cartel's headquarters. Instead, Santiago had gone dark, disappearing into the vast borderland with a small team of his most loyal operators. "He's not running," Thomas explained to his core team, studying the latest satellite imagery. "He's preparing for something else. Santiago never accepted defeat easily. It's what made him such a good student." Marcus nodded, spreading out additional intelligence reports. "Our sources say the cartel's put a price on his head. He's burned too many resources, failed too many times, but that makes him more dangerous, not less." Thomas stood at his command center window, watching the sunrise over his ranch. The property still bore signs of recent battles, but these weren't marks of destruction. They were testaments to the strength of community defense. Each crater, each damaged fence, told a story of unity and resistance. "Santiago's making his final evolution," Thomas said quietly. "He's finally learning the lesson I tried to teach him years ago, but he's learning it the hard way. When everything is stripped away, resources, support, safety, you discover what truly matters." Sarah Chen arrived with fresh intelligence. Santiago's team had been spotted, moving through remote areas, avoiding both cartel territory and law enforcement. But they weren't heading south to safety. They were moving parallel to the border, following a pattern that Thomas immediately recognized. "He's targeting our network nodes," Thomas explained, marking positions on the digital map. "Not the obvious ones. He's going after the connections we've built, the community links that make our defense strong. He's finally understood where our real power lies." The revelation sparked an immediate response from Thomas's team, but he raised his hand for patience. "This is different," he told them. "Santiago's not fighting for the cartel anymore. He's fighting to prove something to himself, and to me." Thomas gathered his closest advisors for a strategy session that went beyond tactical planning. "We're not just facing a military threat," he explained. "We're witnessing someone's final transformation. Santiago has lost everything except his skills and his need to prove himself. That makes this personal in a way that changes everything." Over the next few hours, Thomas outlined a response that surprised even his most experienced operators. Instead of mobilizing their defensive network, he began reaching out to the very community members Santiago was likely to target. "We're not going to fight him," Thomas explained. "We're going to show him what he's been missing all these years. Every person he's planning to target isn't just a tactical asset. They're someone's parent, child, friend, neighbor. They're part of something he once had, but lost sight of. The strategy was unconventional, but profound. Instead of hardening defenses or setting traps, Thomas began activating community connections in ways that would force Santiago to confront the human element he'd forgotten. Local families opened their homes for community gatherings that served as both early warning networks and demonstrations of unity. Children's sports events became opportunities to showcase the connections that bound people together. Every aspect of community life was enhanced rather than disrupted by the threat they faced. Santiago thinks he's hunting weak points in our network, Thomas told his team. What he's actually going to find is something he lost long ago: the understanding that true strength comes from being part of something larger than yourself. The first sign of Santiago's presence came at a small town's weekend farmers market. His team had planned to disrupt what they thought was a key communication node, only to find themselves surrounded by families, children, and neighbors, all going about their normal lives while maintaining perfect situational awareness. Thomas watched through surveillance feeds as Santiago's operators tried to maintain their tactical focus while confronting the reality of what they were targeting. It wasn't just a military objective, it was a living, breathing community. "See how they're hesitating," Thomas pointed out to his team. "They're trained operators, but they're human beings first. Santiago can order them to target these communities, but he can't stop them from seeing what they're really attacking." The pattern repeated across several locations. Each time Santiago's team approached a target, they found not military defenses, but communities going about their lives with quiet strength and unshakable unity. "This is the final lesson," Thomas explained during a team briefing. "Not just for Santiago, but for all of us. The strongest defense isn't the one that stops attacks. It's the one that makes attacks meaningless by showing the attacker what they're really fighting against." As days passed, Santiago's operations became increasingly erratic. His team's movements showed signs of internal conflict, of operators struggling with the reality of targeting the very thing many of them had once fought to protect. Thomas monitored the situation closely, watching his former student grapple with the truth he'd tried to teach him years ago. "Santiago's finally seeing it," he told Marcus during a late-night strategy session. "He's realizing that all his tactical brilliance, all his military expertise, means nothing compared to the strength of a united community." The turning point came during an attempted operation against a small border town's high school football game. Santiago's team had identified it as a key coordination event for Thomas's network, which it was, but not in the way they thought. As they prepared to disrupt the game, Santiago found himself watching families cheering for their children, neighbors supporting each other, and a community bound together by something stronger than any military doctrine could explain. Thomas, observing through surveillance systems, saw the moment his former student finally understood. Santiago stood down his team, and for the first time in years, he saw past the tactical objectives to the human reality he'd forgotten. "He's ready now," Thomas said quietly, initiating the final phase of his plan. Instead of moving to capture or eliminate Santiago's team, he sent them an invitation, not to surrender, but to remember what they'd once fought for. The message was simple. The strength you're seeking isn't found in victory over others. It's found in being part of something worth protecting. As sunrise approached, Thomas waited at his ranch's main gate. He knew Santiago would come, not as an attacker now, but as someone finally ready to learn the lesson that had eluded him for so long. The reunion of teacher and student wouldn't be a military confrontation, but a reminder that true strength comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you choose to protect and preserve. In the end, Thomas Cooper's greatest victory wasn't defeating his enemies. It was showing them why the communities they targeted were stronger than any weapon or tactic ever could be. The sunrise painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold as Santiago approached Thomas's ranch alone. His team had taken positions in the surrounding hills, not as threats, but as witnesses to what would become their final lesson. Thomas stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching his former student walk the same path he'd once traveled as a promising young operator. "You've changed," Santiago said as he reached the porch steps. His voice carried the weight of recent revelations rather than hostility. Thomas nodded, offering a second cup of coffee. "So have you. Finally seeing what I tried to show you all those years ago?" The two men settled into the weathered chairs that had hosted countless training debriefings. Around them, the ranch was coming to life, not just as a military facility, but as the heart of a community that had proven stronger than any tactical operation. "I thought I understood power," Santiago admitted, watching local families arrive for the day's training activities. "Thought it was about having the best training, the most resources, the perfect strategy, but these past weeks, you've seen what real strength looks like," Thomas finished for him. "Not in weapons or tactics, but in the connections between people who understand that protecting each other is more important than any military objective." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of children for their morning self-defense classes, a program Thomas had started that taught not just physical skills, but the importance of community and mutual support. Santiago watched as parents and instructors worked together, creating an environment that balanced security with normalcy. "Your network isn't just about military defense, is it?" Santiago asked, understanding finally dawning. "Every activity, every connection, it's all part of something bigger." Thomas smiled, seeing his former student grasp the lesson he'd tried to teach years ago. The strongest defense isn't built with walls or weapons, it's built with trust, unity, and the understanding that every person has something valuable to contribute. Throughout the day, Santiago witnessed the full scope of what Thomas had created. The ranch wasn't just a training facility. It was a living example of how military expertise could serve and strengthen a community rather than isolate from it. Former special operators taught alongside local teachers in youth programs that combined tactical awareness with civic responsibility. Combat medics worked with school nurses, sharing knowledge that would benefit the entire community. Every aspect of military training was integrated into civilian life in ways that enhanced rather than disrupted it. "This is what I missed," Santiago reflected as they toured the property. "I took your tactical lessons, but missed the deeper wisdom. You weren't just teaching us how to fight, you were showing us what's worth fighting for." Thomas led Santiago to the command center, where screens showed not just security feeds, but community activities across their network. Each event, each gathering, each simple interaction contributed to a defense that was more powerful than any military force. "The cartel thought they could defeat us by targeting our weakest points," Thomas explained. They never understood that our apparent weaknesses, our families, our communities, our connections, are actually our greatest strengths. As evening approached, Santiago's team gradually emerged from their positions, drawn not by orders but by curiosity about what they were witnessing. Thomas welcomed them all, not as former enemies, but as students who were finally ready to learn. "Your skills, your training, they're valuable," Thomas told the assembled operators. "But they're only tools. The real power comes from understanding how to use those tools to protect and strengthen the communities we serve." The transformation was visible as Santiago's team integrated into the evening's activities. Hardened operators found themselves helping with youth programs, sharing their expertise in ways that built up rather than intimidated. The very men who had come to destroy this community were now experiencing what it meant to be part of one. "I understand now why we couldn't defeat you," Santiago said as they watched his team interact with local families. "We were fighting against something we didn't understand, something we'd all lost sight of in our pursuit of tactical perfection." Thomas nodded, seeing the same realization he'd witnessed in countless students over the years. The greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's transforming them into allies by showing them a truth they've forgotten. As night fell, Thomas gathered everyone, his team, Santiago's operators, and community members, for a final lesson that went beyond military doctrine or tactical theory. "Look around," he told them. "What you see isn't just a defense network. It's a living example of what's possible when we remember that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to fight, but in our capacity to unite, to protect, and to build something larger than ourselves." The Cartel's campaign against Thomas's network had failed, not because they lacked resources or tactical skill, but because they had failed to understand what they were truly fighting against. They had encountered not just a military defense, but the unshakable strength of communities united in purpose and resolve. Santiago and his team chose to stay, not as subordinates, but as students ready to learn a new way of applying their skills. The very operators who had come to destroy Thomas's network would now help strengthen it, understanding finally that true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to protect and preserve. Thomas Cooper's ranch remained a premier training facility, but its greatest lesson wasn't found in tactical doctrine or combat techniques. It was written in the daily lives of communities that had learned to transform military expertise into something far more powerful, the unshakable strength of people united in the defense of what truly matters. As the stars emerged over the Texas landscape, Thomas looked out over his property, seeing not just a military facility, but a living testament to the truth he'd spent his life teaching: that the strongest warriors aren't those who fight alone, but those who understand that true victory lies in building and protecting something greater than themselves. The legacy of the old rancher who trained Special Forces snipers would live on, not just in the skills he taught, but in the wisdom he shared, that in a world of increasing conflict, the greatest strength still lies in the connections we build, the communities we protect, and the understanding that true power comes from unity, purpose, and the unwavering defense of what we hold dear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.